First of all, just I think on behalf of us to respond to thank the board for the kind remarks in relation to the awful death of a colleague in London, but also the contribution that Trey's made in terms of how he's dealt with life-changing injuries and continues to contribute to community. So that's really appreciated. I'm conscious that even in your introduction, it just reminds us of the sheer breadth of stuff that we have to wrestle with at the moment. And you talked in your opening remarks about the spotlight being under a number of things, and I think it's part of the report today before you is to try and remind members about the tempo sort of feels relentless at the moment. There's three particular issues that I think are buffeting against each other at the moment. Clearly, as you said in opening comments, the policing of COVID restrictions continues to be a matter of almost daily concern and scrutiny. Indeed, Alan's just joined us fresh from the meeting with the executive. I think, obviously, the matter of the moment seems to be the policing of the wearing of face masks. I think it's important to recognise that from what we see from both the retail sector and from Translink, there's about 90% compliance actually with the restrictions and the desire for people to behave in that social distance space in which face masks are part. And I think maybe one of the messages to come for today is that we don't necessarily see this as a place for policing to be interrupting people's lives. Clearly we have the 4 E's approach, and on occasions the 3 E's, encourage and explain, should be sufficient if officers come across people not wearing a face mask. And obviously on occasions there'll be legitimate reasons for medical reasons, etc., while people won't. So I know it's a live issue, but actually we're here to follow the health regulations and the direction set in that context rather than turn it into a police enforcement issue. The other thing I think that's worth remembering in that space of what should policing be doing to support all of us in keeping safe and keeping the virus at bay is that when you round the clock back to March, that effectively society shut down, the amount of work that we had to do with dropped by a third, and in some cases more than that. So we were able to reorganise to effectively police the movement of people around the country when the virus was probably at its most extreme. You'll see from the report though now that work has turned back to pretty much normal levels. Crime is creeping up to where we'd expect it to be. Antisocial behaviour has gone up significantly, and only about a fifth of that is attributed to being COVID-related behaviour in communities. So that is stretching the availability of frontline officers to deal with a whole raft of stuff. And similarly, as you saw only last weekend, the policing of protest remains an issue for us. So we had a demonstration in the prison, but also a number of simultaneous protests here in the city, and that again consumes officer time at the same time as dealing with calls for help from the public and investigating crime. I'm pleased that we've had a chance to reference the HMIC report. That's clearly one of a number of bodies that holds to account. You referenced the other one in relation to custody. And I think it is a tribute to hard work of all sorts of people that sometimes you overlook the fact that there are 3 good assessments there, which puts us in a strong comparable place to the bulk of policing in England and Wales. And that's sometimes a fine balancing act, because the uniqueness of the context here, we're the only armed police service in the whole of the United Kingdom, sometimes puts us out on a limb and sometimes may feel that we're a bit insular, but actually this is the first time actually that we've gone through a moderation process without any qualification. So we're put up against our peers in another setting. So the fact that we've got 3 goods, albeit there are some areas where we've already recognised that there's things we can improve on, and probably some of them, as we may hear later, are identified already. Mark will be coordinating our response. In your report, I think for the first time, and I know it will hit the public domain later, is an infographic that tries to just point some headlines in relation to the COVID policing picture. We've nearly issued 1,000 penalty notices now through the work that you'll hear from Alan later, who continues to work really hard alongside a number of other roles to coordinate our response here. And even in the weekend gone, we visited over 350 licensed premises as part of doing our bit to make sure that people are hearing the message from the executive and also abiding by social distancing guidelines or restrictions. I think in terms of expectations, the thing that you will hear from Alan later is that the thing we have zoned in on in the last few weeks, following the medical evidence, is house parties in terms of the enforcement piece, and there are specific details in the report there. And also at the same time, we have to remember that as an organisation, we are not immune to the virus ourselves, so have practices and process in place to do when officers or staff fall ill, but also the issue of isolation that falls out of the contact trace regime. But I think it's worth to stress that at the moment we're quite confident in terms of our staffing levels and resilience and our adaptability to deal with this. And indeed, that was probably highlighted by the joint review we've just finished with the Garda, where we've written to you with the details of that review, that shows that actually, whilst some bits on the margins were different, there was some areas in the middle where broadly we adopted the same approach, but I think the refreshing thing was that spirit of transparency, openness and mutual learning in the space of how we police the whole of the island of Ireland in a crisis like this, which frankly will not respect a border. One of the things that's always been at the back of people's minds, I suppose, is the effects on community and neighbourhood policing. That does manifest itself in the review, where we did take slightly different approaches for different operational reasons, but our commitment is that any degradation of neighbourhood policing in the months ahead is absolutely an option of last resort. None of us quite know over a 6-month window where the pressures of policing the virus as well as other issues will take us, but we want to preserve neighbourhood policing. I think there's a few things just to quickly highlight moving forwards before we take questions. Today, obviously, the 1st of October is Black History Month. There'll be a number of initiatives we'll be commenting on as the month goes ahead to show our support for promoting equality and tackling racism. And then on another front, Monday, the 5th of October, is quite an important day for us in terms of it will signal a number of promotions to new jobs for people at Chief Superintendent and Superintendent rank right across the organisation. That will affect some of you in local district policing roles, but actually there are other roles we've created to support the momentum of change and also dealing with some of the specifics. So, for example, a new person going to support Mark, who is our Gold Commander for dealing with the EU exit. It's worth signaling as well that Hate Crime Awareness Week is creeping up on us. That will be between the 10th and 17th of October. I know it's an issue that Mark has put a huge amount of effort into, both here and indeed across the UK, given his Police Chiefs Council role. Again, signaling ahead, you kindly referenced the investment we've made in the Intercept team. I was on patrol with that earlier in the month. I haven't made it on a train yet, but that's a forthcoming attraction with the transport team. But in seriousness, that is about preparing to invest in making the movement of people around the country a safe experience, because that encourages economic growth and cohesive communities. So we recognise we have a part to play there. Also, in terms of new things, subject to some final consultation with yourselves in a fortnight's time, we are about to embark on the new uniform trial. You'll see a number of options when we bring that down in a couple of weeks' time. It'll be rolled out in 6 sites across the country for roughly 3 months, so we test both durability and officer and public reaction. And then you also made mention earlier, Chair, about the future, and I'm pleased to report that we've now had a signal from the Department of Justice that our 3 big ticket items in terms of the future, i.e. the 7,500 officers, digital policing and the investment in new estate, are now proceeding to full business case. That doesn't mean we've yet got the money, but it's a positive sign that we're able to sort of move it through the bureaucracy to see where the government can invest in policing. You did mention the custody review. Obviously that's hot off the press. Mark's got a process in place in his criminal justice part of his portfolio to see how we address any of the areas for development, but again, it's this signal we've come a long way. That said, I think custody is an area where eventually I think we need to have some different conversations with you about the distributed nature of our custody centres. Some are small, some really don't reflect modern standards and again require investment, so that will be an issue for future discussion. Finally, in terms of what Mark is doing, I'm sure we'll have some questions later, because sometimes it's easy to overlook the fact that the EU exit in whatever form is only a few months away now. He's now taken up the command of this issue in Police Speak as the Goal Commander. We have a new dedicated lead who will start on Monday, and actually from the other sort of issue of learning and governance that we've put in place, that as a senior team we'll be operating as what we call a platinum group to give assurance to Mark's decisions from next week. I'm sure there'll be questions on this as we go through the afternoon, because clearly there are a lot of concerns about how we track people in a different environment, and equally how we move information around to keep communities safe. The analogy I'd like to try and draw upon is that rather than things stopping and heading towards a cliff, it's a bit imagining you're going backwards in time, so you're moving from Wi-Fi to a modem. So in effect you'll still have some connectivity, it will just take a lot longer, and that's our assessment of the worst case at the moment. But clearly, as Mark will probably tell you later, we're patched into a lot of UK level working groups to try and support the negotiations so that there isn't a dramatic degradation in service. But the final thing to point out is that despite some of the optimism in other parts of our policing arena, we would welcome your support in securing the outstanding money from the Department of Justice to police the Brexit challenge. We're still £4.5 million light of what was committed. We can absorb that pressure in the short term, but clarity of what that means for us in the weeks ahead will be welcome.